History panel presented by the Museum of Graffiti, featuring the artists Daze, Crea8, Crea8, Trixter, and Antar. We're very excited to be hosting this panel today during Black History Month to celebrate their contributions to the art form and talk about their experiences as men of color in their lives and in their art. And so first up, we have Daze. Daze was born in 1962 in New York City. He began his prolific career painting New York City subway cars in 1976 while attending the High School of Art and Design. He remains one of the few artists of his generation to make the successful transition from the subways to the studio. His first group show was the seminal Beyond Words at the Mud Club in 1981. Soon after, his first solo exhibition was held at Fashion Moda, an influential alternative art space in the South Bronx. 1 year later, the Sammlung Ludwig Aachen, Germany acquired the first of several paintings for their permanent collection. Since then, he has exhibited in numerous solo exhibitions in such cities as Paris, Monte Carlo, Singapore, Beijing, Florence, and Buenos Aires. Ellis's work has continued to be included in many group shows and museum surveys internationally. He has completed many public art projects around the world, and his work can be found in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of the City of New York, and many other institutions around the world. He continues to live and work in New York City. Welcome, Daze.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Next up, we have Crea8. Crea8, a New York City native, emerged from the downtown graffiti movement to exhibit alongside fellow artists Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, and many others. He appeared in the historic 1982 PBS documentary Style Wars, which tracks subway graffiti in New York. As a creative director of hip-hop mogul Russell Simmons' Def Jam Recordings, he co-founded The Drawing Board, the label's in-house visual design firm, where he created visual identities, album covers, logos, and advertising campaigns for Run DMC, Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, and many, many others. He exhibits, lectures, and teaches workshops at institutions around the world, such as the MoMA, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Museum of the City of New York. He has co-authored Definition, the Art and Design of Hip Hop, published by HarperCollins, and designed Def Jam Recordings, the first 25 years of the last great record label, published by Rizzoli. Say's work explores the relationship between transformation and discovery. His practice involves dismantling various imagery and paper elements to build multiple layers of color, texture, shadow, and light. Say draws inspiration from 60s pop art, sign painting, comic books, and popular culture. His work focuses on themes including pop culture, race and gender relations, cultural and community issues. Welcome, Say.
Good to be here.
Next up, we have Trixter, which I'm not sure if he's in the house yet, but we hope that he joins us momentarily. Trixter hails from the US Midwest world capital city of Chicago. Trixter is a pioneering originator in the development of Chicago graffiti trends and style and the growing international urban arts movement. He's recognized across the globe and has received numerous accolades and awards for his practice of graffiti and mainstream arts. Currently, Trixter is nearing completion on a new work due to be available in late 2021 and developing a formal preservation organization for the art, craft, and science of graffiti and the emerging science of graphology. Next up, we have Crea8. Eric King Crea8 Walker has been creating art for 40 years strong and continuing to do so in the art scene to make a difference in helping others through art as therapy. In the early 80s in Los Angeles, he made a name for himself in the art form called style writing, but more commonly referred to as graffiti art. He has exhibited masterpieces in the Pasadena USC Pacific Asia Museum, the California African American Museum, LACMA, MoCA, and many others. As a commercial artist, he has worked with clients including McDonald's, Nike, General Motors, Mars, Dodge, music label, films, and others. His creative diversity embraces many styles for almost anyone and is truly a force to be reckoned with. Sorry about that. Welcome, King Crea8.
Hey, what
Antar
up, what up?
Fierce. Last but not least, Antar Fierce was born and raised in Bed-Stuy section of Brooklyn, New York in the early 1970s. When activities that were related to hip hop was coming into its own in the late 70s, Fierce was there to experience and witness it as it swept in like brush fire from the north. In 1985, he took interest in graffiti on the subway and began documenting, collecting, and archiving it. He relocated to Atlanta, Georgia in 1989 to attend Clark Atlanta University. Arriving in Atlanta, he quickly noticed graffiti also arrived there before he did. Not just in the streets, but it was also beginning to appear on the freight trains that traveled all over the continent and passed by the university campus. Naturally, he took out his camera and got to work. After graduating with a BA in history, Fierce entered the workforce. He spent the next 20 years in the corporate sector. In 2015, he joined four friends and co-founded the Right Track program, a youth development organization designed to inspire young people to use the traditional elements of hip hop to mine their creativity and turn it into sustainable success. With his work at the Right Track program, Fierce realized education was his calling. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in creative and innovative education at Georgia State University. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So-
Good afternoon, everyone.
And so today we're going to be talking about African-American history and your personal experience as Black men in the graffiti movement. And I want to ask you all to relate to the early beginnings, and beginning with you, Daze, I'd like to ask you a little bit about what it was like to start off as a writer in the mid 1970s in New York City, and in particular being a Black writer in the city back then.
Well, in the mid 1970s, I entered the High School of Art and Design in Manhattan, and that's kind of where I started meeting writers. I noticed writing on trains way before that, but that's when I started really meeting people that were going out and painting and being a part of all that. And it kind of answered some questions, but then again, it opened up this whole world of other questions that I had, like where do you get your paint? Where do you go paint? What layups, yards, whatever. And, I started to kind of politic with writers that, guys that were really active. I would say that the demographic of the High School of Art and Design was that, there were kids from all different boroughs that were going there. It wasn't really like a neighborhood high school. It was a specialized art high school for art. So because of that, it was pretty diverse, and I felt that, writing on the subways in New York City was a predominantly Black or Latino thing. It was also multicultural, and I think that really what mattered, it was one of the few worlds that what mattered was what you did, and not so much who you are, because the culture itself was so underground. You have to kind of realize that at that point, like painting trains, it wasn't a cool thing at all. There was no cool aspect to it at all. Your peers, they were going out, they were playing ball in the park, they were going to parties, they were trying to, wear fly clothes, whatever. And, meanwhile, you're coming home at like 2, 3 in the morning with paint on your sneakers, dirty clothes from being in a tunnel or a yard. And people are, you're just trying to be nondescript and kind of blend into the scenery. And people are just kind of looking at you like, why are you doing that? And because of that, the culture was really underground socially as well, so, this is before, of course, social media and the internet and those things, where getting the information is so much easier. I mean, then the information about all that had to really be passed down from one generation to another, by word of mouth and by kind of hanging out, paying your dues, observing what's happening, taking your own mental notes. And that's pretty much how you gained your knowledge of what was happening and how you made your way, through the world as a writer.
And, so your experience in the High School of Art and Design as this multicultural place kind of gave you this really interesting and diverse look at writers from all over the city. Did you notice or feel or any difference between Black writers in those early days and other writers, let's say the Puerto Rican writers that you mentioned, or stylistically, was it all the same? Was it by neighborhood? Was there at all any sort of differentiation? And I guess more so stylistically than not.
Truthfully, not so much. I mean, as for example, in art and design, I moved with, as a mentor, I looked up to this guy named Chino Malo, who was an older Latino writer. He was amazing. He was a few grades older than me, and when I looked up to him, he was stylistically, he was amazing. But there was another guy, Don One, who was a white writer who moved in circles in the Bronx and wrote with people like Butch and Case and was aware of all, and that guy was amazing too, but in terms of the writers that were really like mentoring me, one of the people was Dean BYB, who was from Queens, who was originally from Manhattan, but at that point he was out in Queensbridge. And he wrote with people like Jester and Cliff, who I also kind of idolized, at that point. And he was one of the first guys that really told me, like, yo, you have to, don't just put up what you're doing in Black books. I mean, that's cool, that's artistic, but you need to go out there and you need to start painting. Later on, I first became aware of Phase 2, who was a really like a godfather in this whole thing. I first became aware of him from his hip hop flyers. And then later on, I met him, and he taught me a lot about the development of style as a mentor. He would look at what I was doing and be like, yeah, that's cool, but I know you can do better. You can do better than that. You can push it further. And his whole thing was about the evolution of style and the continuation of it. He would do a style, he would drop it, he would give other people style. And when he got too comfortable with that, he would move on to the next thing. And I really observed that, and I really learned a lot from him, as a mentor.
Wonderful. And so, there were these truly well-known and well-respected writers, like you mentioned, Phase 2 and Don One and Chino Malo, that were in the scene early on. And then there were those that really had an impact, not just to yourself personally, but citywide.
I mean, for example, you just showed a photo of a Stay High 149 piece on the train. And Stay High was his signature. He had one of the few signatures that could really stop you in your tracks. I mean, I remember going out to Rockaway, which is in New York, is like, the end of the line for the A train to go visit Is the Wiz. And I saw a Stay High tag in the station. And I was like, I stopped and I was like, wow, yo, what was he doing out here? Like, it really would stop you in the tracks. Super Cool was another guy that was incredible. Yeah, I mean, these guys were amazing. Staff 161, AJ 161. Their signatures would really kind of like stop you in your tracks because they were so impressive.
Thank you for that. And say, how about for you and your experience coming out of Queens?
Well, similar to some of the things that Daze said, Queens, there were just more people tagging. So style wasn't even something that was on my radar until my buddy Bay TPA started talking about what was going on in the Bronx and in Harlem on the number lines, because I lived on the letter lines and none of that was happening over there. So you had to travel to see those things. but also, these are the early days in the 70s where people would share photos, and that was how you gained knowledge and information. We would huddle together in our bedrooms or somebody else's bedroom, and you'd practice in your black book. You'd look at photos. This was the early days of people doing small acrylic paintings and things like that. And all the development happened in your room. And then you knew, in order to get respect from your peers, you had to go outside and you had to physically put these things in a place where other people could see them. And that really tested your ability. That was where can control and all these other things came into play. And we're talking about the mid 70s. At that time, I'm born in 1962. I was a kid. The idea of even stepping out of my door felt scary to, figure out how to get this drawing onto an actual train. There was a whole education process that went along with that.
And so when you started to actually venture out and do that and get this education process, were there neighborhood folks that you looked up to? Were you, aware of the names? And, you mentioned Vade. Beyond that, when you went citywide and you started to see the names, what was that like for you?
Certainly, Jester was a king in my mind. I mean, I can't even tell you how important his name was because, he did it all. He did whole cars, top to bottoms, tons of throw-ups, tags. It seemed as though everywhere you went in the city, he was there at some point in time. It boggles my mind. I can't even tell you to this day, the idea that I can call him a friend, I can't even process it. When I talk to my son and my grandkids, they literally think I am out of my mind because I idolize this guy. And now, for all intents and purposes, he is an old man. He really doesn't understand the impact he made on a young person like me. But that sort of just lives inside me. It's really something that I can't even explain to people because so much time has passed that in a lot of ways, it's not even something that's relevant.
No, I think it's interesting to mention writers like Jester, and then, Daze earlier mentioned Super Cool 223 or Stay High 149. And, these were at the time, really early writers in the movement who happened to be African-American young men. You also mentioned Staff 161. And so they ended up having a tremendous impact early on in the movement because of how prolific they were. And also I would imagine, like you mentioned with Jester, how they had such tremendous style, such great style. And I wonder if, although this was a very diverse movement, if there was something to be said about the contribution of African-American writers that had a wider impact than we might, consider to this point. People like Staff, people like Jester, as an example.
You know what Dave said is true. This is a cult movement at best. You couldn't talk to your family about it. You couldn't talk to your sisters. If it was me and my two little brothers, and we had to keep it to ourselves. It was as though you had this secret that you really couldn't share with the people that were in your family because it was illegal and it was dangerous. And to some degree, if people were older, it just seemed like silly kid stuff. And I'm not trying to diminish the beauty that came out of it, but I'm just telling you what the climate was like in the 70s.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of have no idea. I mean, to this day, I have no idea what my parents thought about the whole thing. I mean, they probably got some of the picture, but not all the picture, for example, I would test out my paint in my closet. So all of a sudden my closet had all these colors, where I was just testing out my paint to see if it worked, to see what was going on, my ink, everything. So that was demolished, And then the fact that, I would come home at like 2, 3 in the morning, later than that, sometimes daybreak, and just kind of almost try to sneak in the house. And, I had, really, I don't know what they were thinking, but, they would look at the drawings and I feel like they could see, even though they couldn't read it or fully understand it, they could see that it was something that was serious for me, that I was serious about, and that I was trying to develop. And there was some kind of artistic merit to it. So that's about it. That's as far as I, I can go in as far as what their preconceptions might have been about writing. But it was really an outsider thing, very insular. It became my whole world at one point. If I wasn't going out racking paint, I was drawing in my black books, politicking with other writers, hanging out at the bench, painting, then spending countless hours on a subway platform trying to photograph and document the work that I had done. That's like your whole life right there, and there's not much room for anything else.
I'm curious about outside of the world of writing and your friends and sort of this insulated sort of outsider, underground group. What was it like to be a young Black teenager, a young Black man moving around the city, doing those things that you're talking about, moving to, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning? We hear, and I remember stories of its danger, the danger of the city in the 70s, and it definitely was that way in the 80s. And I definitely felt threatened by adults in the city, and certain neighborhoods were almost, you couldn't even go there. And so I wonder if what you experienced, being, young and Black and just moving around in places where maybe you weren't supposed to be.
Well, I can tell you one story specifically that was related to writing. I went out, at rack paint like every writer did then. So I went out to this neighborhood in, I think it was Bensonhurst, and to rack paint, So I'm in the store, I get like a few cans, and it's a predominantly white and Italian neighborhood, so right away, you know, at, at that point, at that point in time, you're not supposed to be there, right? So I'm in there, I'm in that neighborhood, I'm racking paint, I get paint, and then I get busted. So I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna have to take a beating for this or worse. I don't even know, but I was really lucky that they just told me, like, because it was just a few cans or whatever. They didn't come out and say that, but I just assumed it was just a few cans, that I put the paint back. And then, they kind of yelled at me for a while and they let me go. But I was lucky, really lucky, because neighborhoods in Brooklyn at that point were really segregated still. There was Black neighborhoods, there were white neighborhoods, and yeah, you could definitely catch one, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
What I will add to that is it was crystal clear you couldn't go into a white neighborhood. So how he found himself in Bensonhurst, like the word, was law. Don't even try it. Don't even try it. And forget going into a paint store. Just going into the neighborhood was a serious problem.
Hey, and so, that leads me to bring up Antar, who grew up in Bed-Stuy. And so Bed-Stuy, when you were growing up, was an African-American neighborhood. And so for you, what was your experience like being a writer from a Black neighborhood, but leaving to go to other neighborhoods? Did you also have the same notion of, I can't go to Bensonhurst, or I shouldn't go to Morris Park or other places like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely the climate back then, even though I was, later than Say and Daze, I was more into 80, 83, 84, 85 really is when I started to venture out and start looking at subways at that point, just but the climate in the city at that time, I think, was such that you knew where you couldn't go and you knew where you could go. And I distinctly remember my grandmother, who lived in Forest Hills, actually, and that's where I used to visit and really started painting, like going to the back of the factories and, walking up and down Union Turnpike and, writing for the first time. But I remember her always telling me, you remember they killed that boy for writing graffiti, and she was talking about Michael Stewart, which I think that had happened. Michael Stewart was murdered by the police. He was a graffiti artist, and I don't know the whole detail behind the story. I don't remember it at this point, but I definitely remember my grandmother cautioning me once she figured out what I was doing as far as writing. She definitely was like, you got to remember that. And so that's kind of like how I remember just the experience of being Black. I think once you were in the graffiti community or you were in that world, it was, for better or worse, a racially safe space. But it's still like these guys just mentioned, it's the process of going and getting to it. Whether you're going to bench or whether you're going to write, you still have to get through the city to get wherever you're going. And the climate did not let you forget, hey, you're Black. You certain stuff you just can't do, or you have to be mindful of everything you're doing because you're Black. And so that was definitely real. And especially going out of Bedford-Stuyvesant, where it's just Black people. But then when you get on the subway and you ride to, you go through, Crown Heights, or you go downtown or Brooklyn Heights or wherever, and even into the city or even out to Howard Beach. I remember going out there to bench once and just being like, I got to remember where I'm at, So yeah, there's definitely a consciousness, or there was a consciousness back then of being Black and writing, but it was more driven by the city and the climate, the racial climate in the city at the time.
And so for you, Crea8, coming out of Los Angeles,
Check it in. Peace, y'all. Peace.
Trixter, welcome. Crea8, for
Peace.
you coming in from Los Angeles, did you also feel that as well? This sort of, the 80s racial climate, danger, and maybe, a sense of impending violence as you moved around the city?
Well, it's real interesting because I'm from South Central Los Angeles, and South Central LA. They got different segments of LA. You got your West LA area, your East LA, your South LA. Then you got your Hollywood and the outer zone in LA like that. But coming from South LA is predominantly Black and Chicano culture right there. And growing up in the early '80s in LA was pretty crucial in regards to as being a writer. Our thing was we didn't have subway cars in LA. We had the buses. So a lot of writers was getting up on buses and catching, street tags all over and getting up. And it was interesting because it was a new situation for writers to be getting up throughout the city, especially going through what they call the hoods or the ghettos and stuff. And people was like looking at it like, what the hell are these dudes doing? It was like something totally different and new. The only way we would get a pass to be able to go through certain area was you had to be like a reputable person, or you had to be real fresh for what you was doing. Because like as an example, growing up in different gang territories, uh, they would allow you to be able to do your writing or get up and stuff because they had respect for you. But if you was like a toy, or you was just doing some whack stuff, a lot of them would dish you or they would try to take your paint from you back in them days. And it was very crucial because like it was one of those type of things. Uh, as far as with the climate of just dealing with people, I would say back then it was like they were saying earlier, it's very underground. And so by being underground, most people didn't understand what we was doing, because it was done behind buildings. It was done underneath the tunnels to get from one side of the street to the other side of the street at that time. And people never really knew. So it was like hidden treasure, hidden behind buildings and in places that people would never venture off to unless they was just stumbling across it. And then later on, you know, what was so interesting was that as a black writer is that it primarily, like I was saying, started off as the black and Chicano culture of writing out here in LA. But then towards, I would say, the mid 80s when the crack first came to, well, I didn't say it came in the mid 80s. The crack came a little bit before then, but when the crack and the gang was really heavy, what ended up happening was uh, a lot of the well educated, well, not well educated, the well skillful writers that was out here that was like real heavy with style, they ended up getting into like selling drugs, man, because they felt like forget doing that. They felt like, man, they had to make money. And so a lot of the black writers start gang banging or they start selling dope. And then what ended up happening was it only left a few people such as myself and a couple of other writers out here that's still hanging on. We kept pushing. And so I'm gonna make a real good point. In that process of us still pushing, it started to branch out to the other sides of the city of LA, and then it primarily became it was already uh, black and brown, but then you start seeing primarily a lot of white young writers started to paint a lot more because of the black kids getting bussed out to the far schools on the outskirts. So when they would see our piece books and they would see our back of our jean jackets and they would start seeing all these different things, they was becoming inspired. Not only that, they was watching the movies and the documentaries and stuff. So uh, I'm making a point to where I'm leading to. And then, so what ended up happening was at one point, it got to the point to where it wasn't that many of us still writing. I was writing. I never stopped. But for a lot of the real heavy writers that was real strong, um, when we would go to different yards or we would go to different events, people would look and be like, "You right?" And we like, "Yeah." They was like, "Oh, we didn't know black writers existed," and it was like, "What?" So it was like a weird insult because we was like, "Man, we've been here since the beginning in terms of LA. We was representing, but because so many of us fell off, it started looking weird. To this day, people I meet young black kids that stay in the hood in South Central or in other places, and what ends up happening is that they get happy when they see people like us that's been doing it for years. They like, oh man, they say, wow, it's good to see a they say it's good to see a black face in writing culture, man, because they feel like they're secluded from everything. So yeah, it's real heavy and deep, just the science of it.
Listen, I appreciate that, and it's one of the questions that I've asked. You know, now I'm here in Miami, and I've had the same question, like, where are the black writers? Like,
Yeah,
do they
yeah.
exist? And there's so very few that are in the scene here, and that's not just today. That's throughout the history of Miami. And I'm like, well, man, Miami has, you know, a big black community here. You know, why is that? That there's no writers in the scene? And you know, and the answer that I've received from other people is just it's just access to the information, access to the artists, access. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about the roots of the movement and then this sort of splinter in the 80s, because I remember that happening in my own community in Brooklyn, where all the writers, you know, pretty much all the writers decided to move into, you know, adult things. And part of that was, you know, street hustling. And then there was a vacuum that existed, and it really impacted the younger generations in having access to this information. So thank you for that. And Trixter, I'm curious, you know, with you and your city in Chicago, what was it like for you starting out as a young black man in this movement? Like, how did you just discover this art movement and become involved in it?
Well, essentially coming up in the late 70s, from 77 to 80, I came up on the west side of Chicago, which was a predominantly black community, and it was essential as it was really close to the most populous and active area of the city, the primary area, like downtown, like Manhattan to, you know, to all the other boroughs, kind of, you know, similar. And so at this time, there wasn't a lot of writers. I started painting and doing, well, I started dancing, doing street dancing. This was from 77 to 80. I was in the martial arts and doing dancing and gymnastics. Then that became me interacting with street dancers that were into locking and popping. And, you know, Soul Train started here in Chicago, essentially, and a lot of the founding members of the movement, of the street dance movement, you know, that was synonymous with the growth of hip hop or the common forms of street dance and stuff that were going in the club dance or what have you that was going on in New York. So we had similar cultural things that were going on that related to that. And then I started seeing people, there were some walls and stuff in the community that I would see. You know, this was like 78, 79. There were walls in the community from groups that had been dancing. And so we started mimicking. We started doing our clothes and started decorating, you know, our you know, schoolwork and folders. This was about 80, 81. So I officially started going out doing walls about 81. Like started going out and doing a lot of active murals around the city and catching tags and doing trains and things like that. So at that time, there wasn't a lot of writers on the scene. Like I say, people were, you know, street dancers, people who either were cultural implants or people who had, you know, moved to different cities and stuff like that. That's what I've come to recognize it as. And it's been pretty persistent.
And so when you started getting into it, were there many other people getting into it at the same time? And you know, how did your community perceive it, or was it embraced or looked down upon?
It was very few. It was very few people at that time. Black writers, only like to say the neighborhood crews that were either dancers, and there was a couple of writers here and there, and then there were some social organizations that had did some select murals and storefronts that had became popular in the communities around the south and the west sides of Chicago. And at that time when I started, like that mural, that picture that was just depicted, that was part of a community a mural project of a nostalgia kind of a painting that we had did for community based youth mural project. And it was a great time. It was, I think it was about 85 when we did that. And again, I started interacting up north. As a lot of people may not know, Chicago was a very segregated city. There were, like, you know, a lot of, like, you had a lot of boroughs. We had a lot of communities where people didn't cross the lines. And all of the stories that I've heard, or all of the experiences that were related, are sound similar, and you know, they mirror exactly what I went through. So I won't, like, you know, be repetitious with that. It's amazing to hear, because every time I hear it, it's always the same. You know, you had to get a pass, and we were artists, and because we were artists and they recognized our art, we were allowed to cross those barriers. Otherwise, it wasn't. It was hectic. It, you know, it was very strenuous. There was a lot of gangs, man, and it mirrored, you know, a lot of the things, like when I hear things about the Black Spades and you know, in other cities and cultures, and even in other countries, there were mirroring events that were, you know, had a synchronicity from this development that, you know, that imploded from New York, and it just grew, and it was synonymous, and it happened simultaneous. That was one of the most significant things for me as an artist. So race, you know, as a factor, but essentially the development of the culture was counter to that. It was meant to bring us together, to unify us as, you know, as collective. I think that, as I've seen in my studies, it kind of mirrors what the concept of what America was for, immigrants, a bunch of people coming together, you know, from all walks of life to a common unison, and the concept of hip hop. Some people separate it, but I mean, essentially that's what it's become.
So racial unity within the movement was something that you experienced, and I think all of us experienced that as a small band of artists, of outlaw artists with a common goal, trying to get together and have success in sort of doing this outlaw art form that the rest of the world or the rest of our cities wouldn't really embrace or even really knew about. And what Daze said before, maybe thought it might have been silly or, you know, irrelevant. And I'm curious to know, in Atlanta, Antar, did you also experience that or see that when you first arrived in Atlanta?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, even as far as the number of Black writers. When I was growing up, I mean, in Bed-Stuy, there were writers who were around in the neighborhood. One of them being Nome, who probably was the first, piece that I saw up close on the Kingston handball courts there on Herkimer Street in Bed-Stuy. And that, that is really what propelled me into the throes of this and really got me interested in it. But there were only a few writers that I really knew. I think what a couple of people have already alluded to is by the time 84, 85, 86, there really aren't a lot of Black writers because they became involved in other stuff, other adult activities and other activities out in the street. So I knew of a couple of Black writers in the neighborhood, but it was, when I went outside the neighborhood, a lot of the writers were white. So when I got to Atlanta, one thing I found out relatively fast is that there were still a lot of Black writers here. And the graffiti or the style writing culture, which exists as a secret society almost. So you can go anywhere, and just like we're talking about experiences that we had, in different places, they line up because this is a very tight-knit culture. So the experiences tend to share themselves around the world, especially for Black writers. So yeah, when I got to Atlanta, I definitely realized that, that bond that I would have immediately with writers was there, but I was also surprised because there were a lot more Black writers here when I got here. And even the old writers from Atlanta who were writing before I got here, they were all Black and they were all from the West Side. And, so that presence, evaporated, in the mid to late 80s. And, the presence of Black and African-American writers in the culture. And so when you talk to kids today, it's like, I think Trixter said, how, or maybe it was Crea8, how shocked they were to hear when you go somewhere and it's like, oh, you're a writer, not realizing that, there used to be a lot more writers were Black. And Black writers obviously have a strong tradition and made huge contribution to this culture.
No doubt.
So I'm curious as to know if you guys would have an opinion on why there aren't more Black writers within this movement today.
I think it's like a lot of people said earlier. People of a certain age had to get on with real life.
Mm-hmm.
If my son was born in 1984. Light bulb moment. All this other stuff is kid stuff. I got to get down to business to figure out how to earn a living. I already know I'm an artist. I knew I was an artist since I was a small child. Time to monetize it. Graffiti was kid stuff.
And I think even as a black, I'm sorry, as a Black writer, it's just really, you got to work twice as hard to make a living. So it really becomes, crunch time. Like you said, when you have a child or a family, you got to get it on. And I think that happens to a lot of why there are not more Black writers.
I think also too, there's the factor of, as you said about making money, but even just being taken seriously. I've definitely found in artistic circles that, it's not enough to be talented or whatever. You have to be extra talented and you have to have your shit really together, because otherwise, people are just not going to take you seriously. And it's a real subtle thing, but at the same time, it's very, very real. So with that in mind, you are suddenly in a position where, you have to take your shit seriously if you want to survive.
Wow, that's deep.
So this is more about the representation of African-American artists in the art world in general is what you're speaking to, right? The sort
Yeah,
of
I
a
am.
bit of a bit of a barrier of
I mean,
entry.
it's definitely changing now. I can see, this trajectory from, say, the early 80s to now, and how it's definitely changed, and there are more African American artists who are getting record auction prices, and who are taken seriously, or who are having museum retrospectives. I saw this documentary on this art on Charles White, who is a very renowned African American artist, old school. He was like Kerry James Marshall's teacher. He was, I think, David Hammond's, his teacher. He told a story about how he had this museum exhibition once early on, and he wasn't even allowed to show. He had to kind of come in through the back door because he wasn't allowed to it. It's in a documentary that's out now where he's telling the story, and I just thought that was amazing. But I mean, I think it's definitely changing, but there's still a long way to go.
I mean, it's fascinating. What I'm hearing is that the writing world and this graffiti world that we're talking about is more inclusive than the mainstream art world. We're more accepting. We're more diverse. We're more, let's say, mixed, so to speak, than when you become an adult and you decide to enter into the art world and you face these sort of, racial stereotypes and challenges. And so I wonder if any of you could speak to how that impacts your work. You said before you have to be better, but do you represent your own racial struggle or that identity within the work that you do today as artists?
I just wanted to say one thing because I think it's relatable to writing. In the 70s, the only thing that mattered was talent, style, skill. All the other stuff went out the window. I didn't learn about those things until I went to the bench. And then you got to see what people look like. And then you realize, oh my God, there are Black people doing this that really have skill. It was mind-boggling. We'd all be, remiss not to mention somebody like Dondi. Even though he was biracial, he was a style master, and he set a bar very high for me in the 70s. And I think it's important to mention that because, it's easy for people that paved the way for other people to get lost in a conversation like this when the emphasis, puts too much on color. And, those just weren't conversations that we were having.
Yeah.
When you went into an all-white neighborhood, that was an issue. But when you were with your quote unquote peers, like Daze said in the 70s, it was universal. Style was the thing that mattered.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at these crews that were out then too, like, Dondi's crew, CIA, whose members, were Black and Latino. It was a mixture of people in that crew, and there are other crews that were like that as well, where there was always like a mixture, and the crews mixed because it matters. One, if you had style. The other factor was whether or not you got up. If you got up a lot and your name was everywhere, then you also got a pass. But if you were somebody that just kind of, hopped in and hopped out, people didn't really take you seriously.
I think of these historic Black crews, and you guys were there. I came much later in the 80s, but I hear of the crews like the Ebony Dukes.
Right.
I hear of the 3 Yard Boys, the Ex Vandals, which were predominantly, if not exclusively, Black crews. And I think about their impact. And although we didn't know this, to Say's point, because we didn't meet them and we only saw their names on the walls or on the trains, they did have a significant impact in this diverse culture. It's interesting to try to sort of unpack this and say, okay, we're diverse, it doesn't matter. But then you dig deep and you're like, but wait a minute, there were these groups of people, whether it's, Dondi and CIA or Wicked Gary and Lazar and the Ex Vandals, that were Black and that mattered, but no one necessarily knew they're Black because you only see the names and the style, and that's it. And so I think one of the things that I wanted to make a point of today is not to sort of push this racial agenda and to say, hey, this is about race and say we're separate, but to say, there are heroes in this movement that were African American, that are Black. There was a Black community within this movement that should be at least recognized and known, because although we're in this hip hop kind of kumbaya phase sometimes, and the Zulu Nation sort of mentality, I don't want to forget the people that mattered, sort of like what you were saying before with Charles White. Because their experience maybe in 71 was maybe very different from 75 or 85 or 95. And so, you guys were there very early on. And you're on here because we want to celebrate you and recognize you, of course, as your contribution, because you guys are masters regardless of your racial identity. But you also happen to be Black, and that's pretty interesting and cool. And maybe your perspective is a bit different because of the pressure and these stereotypes that you had to deal with. And go ahead.
No, I think that's a great point. And because I thought about this, and I've been trying to working on a little bit on this project on Black writers, and I think it's important, or in my opinion, I guess, I want to understand it more, because what I also understand is the concept of erasure, and how stories over the years, people of color tend to be left out of those stories when they played integral roles in those stories. And so I always thought about this as a way to not necessarily say, Black writers, but to say that, hey, we need to make sure that we are included in the story, because I agree 100% with what you guys have said previously, is that once you get into that space where the writing happens, where the creativity happens, where the community comes together to actually write, the race is out of the window. And I think that's the beautiful thing about writing, is that it is a space where I believe, or in my experience, that truly does not matter. Your friends matter, the people you're writing with, you're having fun. That is the act, and that is where the space is the most safe. But I think this story is so important, or it's so important to get this story and tell this story and hear these stories, is because if we don't, 100 years from now, we want to make sure that we are in the story, and our role in the development of this culture, we want to make sure that story is told. And that's it's interesting that you brought that up, because I think that's a great point of why we have to continue to do this.
Well, I mean, and Create brought this up earlier, because he was saying, hey, the younger generations, or even what you were saying before, Anton, younger generations meet you and you guys are these OG writers, and they're like, but wait a minute, you're Black. How can that be? There is no such thing as a Black writer. It's
Precisely. And that's happened to me.
I wanted
so
to
it's important.
Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead, bro.
I was going to say, as an example, I was in this big project at the Getty Museum, and originally I wasn't in the lineup of the artists that they first selected to be part of this big, huge book project at the Getty of 150 writers in LA. It just so happened that, I guess when they looked at the lineup, somebody had mentioned my name. They said, what about creating the other people down in the hood? Like, what's up with them in the book? And I got a phone call and ended up being one of the co-curators of the book, where my responsibility was to bring in about, I think, 25 selected artists that I felt was great. And so here's my point. Because I was in that position, I reached out to a lot of the brothers that never got their shine, that was great writers, but they never got their shine. And I pull them into that Getty Museum book that they produced. And guess what happened? Everybody that I bought into the book, I ain't saying they was all brothers. I pulled in a couple of my Chicano brothers, but it was mainly a lot of the brothers that never got their shine. I pulled them into that project. True story, man. We must have. I ain't saying we did the best stuff in the book, but we got busy. We put in some serious work, and I told everybody that submitted work. I said, man, don't go half-ass in the book. I said, I want y'all to do some top-notch work because at this point now we got to make a statement. We have to make a statement because we're not really included in so much of the bigger uh, scheme of things or when big shows are thrown. So now that we got the spotlight, we need to be able to shine, show our work in this proper content of greatness. And man, we did such a damn good job. The people really was it man, they was really blown away by the work, which led into another project at a big museum. Same thing. We went in there, and I was the only black face at the meeting, sitting at the table with everybody else. It was diverse though, but they said, "Well, Crea8, who you bringing in?" I said, "I'm bringing in the troops." And we went into the museum, and we had it was let me see 6 or 8 different sections in the museum. We had a spot way towards the back, but it wasn't no big deal. But I told my buddies, I said, man, we gonna make a powerful statement. We did a piece that said "Sign of the Times," which told a story about the black and the brown culture, the essence of our beginnings in the writing, from the ancient hieroglyphics to the Mayan and Aztec. There you go. That's that piece right there. And man, we went in there and we killed it from top to bottom. The piece was 24 feet tall, 27 feet wide, and we told our story. And when people came into the museum, they gravitated towards the piece and they said, "United we stand" at the bottom. So that was a very powerful piece we produced. We had a chance at the California African American Museum. Same thing. They was like, "Hey, we need some writers to come in here to black writers." So we went in there and we did a piece called "The Supreme Kings." That was the part that me and my group put together, and we told a story. Same thing, but we wanted to make for sure we got our point across, which opened up a lot of doors for us, and it was a good project as black writers. Oh, I don't want to prolong nothing, but watch this very quickly. Shout out to Reefa for putting together Aerosol out there in the Bay Area. Aerosol, uh, it was a big show that from time to time we put the show on, but it includes a lot of writers from back east in New York and all over the place, from Africa, Senegal, and we come together out there in the Bay Area, and man, we just had this big, huge exhibit full of writers that never got their shine, people who have gotten their shine, and man, we had big panel discussions. They actually on YouTube. Shame 125, Scheme, Stand 153, Rest in Peace, Mode 2. All of us was part of this big show. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great event.
So just question for you guys. You know, we're nearing the hour mark, and you know, I want to keep this sort of at about an hour. So, with how does all this stuff that we're talking about, how does race impact your work? Does it impact your work? I could see it in Say's work. I could see it in Daze's work from time to time. I saw something that you sent me, Antar. Do you guys want to, you know, share a few minutes or an example of what you know, what race, and in particular, I think race today, that it's so, I don't know, charged. We're living in such a charged time as a result of the Trump era and everything else that we're experiencing. How does that impact your work, if at all?
Well, you know, because we live in an age of social media, everybody has access to not only your work, but to what you look like. And you know, I'm always going to be a representative of where I come from. So whether it's hailing a cab or showing a piece of work in a, you know, gallery or a museum, and whenever I'm speaking from life experience. I'm older now, so I understand the importance of what I represent in addition to the work that I'm making. And so I think that those things are, you know, what find themselves, you know, as a subject in my work. And it's not like it ever mattered to me, but by default, I have to address it because it's something that represents where I come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think lately, or in the last, definitely in the last 4 years, but even prior to that, you know, I've always, not always, as of late, because, you know, mostly what I've done is paint freights. So, you know, that's always just a mission. That's just getting up. But I have, you know, like Say said, you know, I'm older now, and I have to think beyond, you know, just getting up, and especially the little bit of art or the platform that I have when I'm able to paint something in public, you know, because so much of the struggle is messaging and controlling the message. And so I think it's important for us as Black writers, to, you know, control the message, and even tellers of history. We need to make sure that the message is told authentically. And you know, I've most of the pieces I've done recently have, you know, had positive messaging, uplifting messaging. You know, I'm in a crew called CRE, which stands for Crushing Railroads Excessively, but, you know, I've recently started writing it out as Crush Racism Everywhere. So even when I do paint a train, you know, it has to have something that's positive, something that's uplifting, something that's moving us in the right direction. And even if it's painting a piece that is, you know, for somebody who's you know, been murdered by the police, I think it's important, for me at least, to do that, especially going forward now, because, you know, what else have we got? We really, this is an opportunity for us, to have a role in how, you know, have a role in controlling the message that we get out there. And I've, you know, one of the things I'm trying to really get into is doing that with the writing that I do, especially when it's in public. It has to be something positive.
Okay, let me see. I was going to say, as an example, right now we had a project called the Crenshaw Wall Mural Project, and we was talking about how our culture coincide with our artwork. You know, one thing that I can say about that is that when you look at our styles and flavor, you can see that soulness in it. You know, through our genetics, you can see like our color selections of the richness, the boldness of the color. That's one thing that I noticed. So when I take a look, you can sort of see the difference when you see certain styles done because of a certain maybe cultural background at times. Even though now that we got the internet, people can see so much work globally. But I know it's coming up, and looking at the work that we've created, as a people, you can see a certain flavor within the art. And so when we did this mural for the Crenshaw Wall Mural Project, which is on YouTube, is very interesting because not only were we using visual, but we put the letters with it, and it told a story about Black culture from the beginning of time to what we see into the future. And a lot of people, man, to this day, they tell us, even an officer gave us props. Two police officers, they said that they grew up off of that when they was young, and now they was police officers now, and they was like, wow. They said, man, when I was a kid, they said they used to pass by this wall and they would look and study the history, and the pictures that we painted told a story. So we are in a position as writers to be able to make an impact to our work, but also we also in a position to reach back and to teach the younger generation and to help elevate them, to watch them grow so that it won't be a big generation gap of unsuccessful Black writers developing to we got to pave the way so that we could pull them in and say, hey, this is how you be successful. Because at once upon a time, a lot of people looked at us and said, oh, you're going to be a starving artist. But because of being around other successful people, I realized I don't have to be a successful artist. Like Daze said, if we got our stuff together and we know how to package and present our stuff and walk into places properly, then the more doors would open. So, you know, I think that's key.
I think also I do a lot of workshops and projects with students as well. And, you know, when a question and answer time comes along, you know, they often want to know, well, all right, how do you make a living from this, you know? And I find that they can relate to me a lot easier because I'm coming from a similar background and they're coming from as well, and I'm able to kind of, you know, break certain things down to them so much easier in a way that they can immediately relate to, you know, and it's not something that's flying over their head, but you know, it's something that resonates with them inside, you know, and they can feel it. And you know, you know, those kind of workshop projects, whether they're mural projects or even presentations or whatever, you know, this whole graph thing is something that somehow really that they can relate to in a way. It's coming from a place that they can completely understand.
I love that, and you're right. I think that, you know, both of you, you know, mentioning mentorship or working with youth and sort of paving the way is an important part of contributing to our community. And I mean, I think now as we've grown in age and we're adults or even older, where we might have grandkids, we sort of understand the need to educate the generations and share this art form that's contributed to our lives positively. And so, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time today,
Thank you.
and for this discussion. I think it's the beginning of more discussions around our collective history, our shared experiences, and our love for this art form. And so, Daze, Say, Crea8, Trixter, Antar, I appreciate you very much. The Museum of Graffiti appreciates your contributions and your ongoing work very much. And we look forward to seeing you guys in the future, hopefully after COVID and all this stuff starts to normalize. We can start to move around again.
That'd be great.
Thanks.
It'd be great. It's an honor.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. It's a pleasure. It's an honor.
Definitely a
Yeah.
pleasure. All you guys have a great day.
You too.
Likewise, hey, we all need to stay in contact so we can all make some moves together.
Yes,
That'd be
sir.
great, man. Definitely. I welcome it.
Well,
All
we
right,
all
y'all.
in that email thread, right, Kat?
Yes, everybody
Yeah.
shared on this email thread. This will be posted to share. You'll see lots of comments. And so for everybody in the comment section, you can find everybody's hashtags. And so if you want to reach out to these artists directly, we encourage that. We encourage an active community and active sharing. You can visit us online at the museumofgraffiti.com. If you check out our YouTube channel, you'll see lots of talks with artists, including Daze, including Say, and including Crea8 on there. And so we encourage you to dive into these oral histories so you can learn a little bit about these tremendous artists that are from our community, and I'm going to share them with your folks. And we hope that you'll support us at the Museum of Graffiti and in person as well. So thank you again, and we'll see you very soon.
Peace. Thank you.